Good evening. I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this fall presentation of the UCI Chancellor's Distinguished Speaker Series. It's a special occasion because we're kicking it off in the fall, 2018-2019, and I hope to invite you to come back. The audience today reflects many members of our community. There are undergraduates here, graduate students, postdocs, staff, and faculty, as well as members of our community whom we serve and partner with. And so I want to take the occasion to acknowledge members of the UCI Foundation, the CEO Roundtable, as well as two individuals who partner with us. And they include Michelle Dutchman, who is the executive director of the UC Washington Base Free Speech Center, as well as Peter Levy, who is the Orange County representative of the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you for joining us, and as is my custom, I want to invite you to take less than a minute to greet the partner seated next to you, tell them your name, and make this a special evening. The purpose of this series is to bring to our great university a diverse group of distinguished individuals. The speakers include thought leaders, public intellectuals, creative artists, and innovators. Each presentation provides an opportunity for them to share their vision, to communicate their insights about our society and world, and above all, to think about the future together. What makes this series so valuable is that it's a product of the ideas and nominations from the campus community. The speaker today was selected from students, faculty, and staff, and I think the series reflects the intellectual breadth, the probing curiosity, as well as a sense of fun that reflects our very diverse community. This series also underscores UCI's role as an important public square for the nearly 3 million residents that call Orange County home. In this spirit, I want to invite you to learn more about the events and programs of the Office of Inclusive Excellence by visiting our website at inclusion.uci.edu. And in the meantime, I want to invite you to join us November 1st for a presentation by Anita DeFrance. She is the vice president of the International Olympic Committee and a former Olympic medalist. And she'll be discussing the role of athletes as agents of social change. Next year in April, on the 22nd, we'll be hosting Tarana Burke. She is the founder of the hashtag #MeToo. And then she'll be discussing where this movement that she helped launch is headed, particularly after the first year. Now, at this time, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the 6th Chancellor of UCI, Dr. Howard Gilman, an award-winning scholar, teacher, who specialized in the American Constitution and the Supreme Court. He's also a national leader in advocating for free speech. In fact, just last year, he and Erwin Chemerinsky published Free Speech on the College Campus. And in that book, he made a compelling case for the indispensable role of the First Amendment in our civic life and the role of universities as the public squares of the nation and the world in the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Gilman.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, and good evening, everyone. And what a good evening it is going to be. You know, as Doug mentioned, tonight's event is presented by the Chancellor's Distinguished Speaker Series in conjunction with our new initiative on confronting extremism. And before we allow the event to unfold, there are two great leaders that have helped us with each of these events. And I hope you'll join me in thanking Vice Provost Douglas Haynes and Vice Provost Judy Stepan-Norris for their leadership in each of these initiatives. They did a good job. They did a good job. You know, the Confronting Extremism initiative was initially developed in the wake of the tragic events in Charlottesville in 2017 and was motivated by a central question: how should great universities respond to the rise of white nationalism and other forms of political extremism that threaten our central values and the values that sustain free, diverse, and democratic societies? Our decision was to do what universities were designed to do: sponsor serious academic investigations, identify important research questions, and generate knowledge that could illuminate the issues and better prepare society for addressing the challenges. The world will confront extremism in a variety of ways, but we will do so by creating and transmitting knowledge. As the project was developed, we soon realized that our core values were threatened by a number of developments, not just terror-based acts of extremist violence, but efforts to systematically deny the legitimacy of scholarly research and replace it with a world of politically convenient alternative facts. Universities are places where people of all backgrounds come together and pledge to use their reason to address and debate the most enduring, challenging, and interesting questions facing humankind. This mission is undermined both when members of our community are dehumanized and when some attempt to delegitimize the very idea of pursuing truth through the practices and norms of a great scholarly community. Fundamentally, our initiative is about defending the fundamental premises that underlie the mission of a university, premises forged during the Enlightenment, and this gets us to the importance of tonight's event. Steven Pinker is an experimental psychologist who conducts research in visual cognition, psycholinguistics, and social relations at Harvard University, a quaint institution of higher education on the eastern side of the country. It's a good university. Much of his research focuses on language and mind, but he has become drawn to these disciplines because he believes they are a window into human nature itself. In addition to his scientific prowess, he has also been committed to writing about these topics to general audiences. He has won many awards, including the Troland Award from the National Academy of Sciences. He's the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary, which means that when you formulate your questions, make sure you're using your words properly. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His TED Talks have been viewed by millions of times. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's been named Humanist of the Year. He's received 9 honorary doctorates. Time magazine has declared him to be one of the 100 most influential people in the world today. Dear friends, will you please join me in a warm welcome of our very special guest, Professor Steven Pinker.
Thank you very much. From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with so much trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as imponderable as these questions may seem, many people have answers to them. For example, religion. Morality is dictated by God in holy scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Demons. Problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Nationalism. Our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Reaction. In the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe, but it's not as easy to put our fingers on what we do believe. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the 18th century Enlightenment. Namely, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Now, many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they've faded into the background as a kind of bland default or status quo or establishment. Other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I have tried to do in Enlightenment Now. The Enlightenment centers on 4 themes, I suggest: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. In contrast, reason is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you start to explain why you're right, why other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of baloney, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to agree that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. As a species, we are likely to generalize from anecdotes, to reason from stereotypes. We seek evidence that confirms our beliefs, and we ignore evidence that disconfirms them, and we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment idea was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. Science, moreover, provides not just technical know-how, but fundamental insights about the human condition. Naturalism. The universe has no goal or purpose related to human welfare, with the implication that if we want to improve that welfare, we have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Entropy. In a closed system, disorder increases. Things fall apart. Stuff happens. Not because the universe has it in for us, but because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than for things to go right. Evolution. Humans were shaped by a process which selects for reproductive success, not well-being. As Immanuel Kant put it, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be built. The third Enlightenment ideal I suggest is humanism, that our ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Well, enhance human flourishing. Who could be against that, you might think? Well, in fact, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to magnify the glory of the tribe, the race, the nation, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and coerce others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical dialectic struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. By default, our circle of sympathy, admittedly, is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our biological relatives, our close friends and allies, and maybe cute little furry baby animals, but that's about it. However, our circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, including education, journalism, art, mobility, and even reason itself. As soon as I enter into discourse with you, I can't insist that only my interests count because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Reason pushes toward a interchangeability of perspectives and equality of interests. Finally, that leads us to progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Now, you might ask, if human nature doesn't change, how could progress even be possible? And an answer from the Enlightenment is that it's possible through benign institutions, through which allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to combat entropy, to magnify the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln called them, such as reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our hunger for dominance and revenge. What do I mean by institutions? Well, some examples that are gifts of the Enlightenment include democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies, and a free press. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because I have found that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think that we can solve problems, I have been told, that means that you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to the Voltaire character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Well, Professor Pangloss, as it happens, was a pessimist. A true optimist would say there can be much better worlds than the one that we find ourselves in today. But all of this is irrelevant because the question of whether progress has taken place is not a matter of having a sunny disposition or wearing rose-colored glasses or seeing the glass as half full. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit that is progress. Let's go to the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. But then, starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, with the discovery of vaccination, sanitation, later antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy at birth has soared to 71 years worldwide, and virtually no one guesses that it's that high. The escape from universal early death was highly uneven. It began in Europe and the Americas, but more recently, Asia has almost caught up, and sub-Saharan Africa is showing spectacular gains. For most of human history, the biggest contributor to low life expectancy at birth was child mortality, the vulnerability of small human beings. In 1750, in Sweden, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday, before Sweden brought the rate of child mortality down 100-fold to 0.3%, followed by other parts of the world, such as in North America, Canada, in Asia, South Korea, in Latin America, Chile, and in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, which has brought its rate of child mortality down from a quarter to about 6%. Still too high, but the progress is continuing. Mothers, too, were in lethal jeopardy whenever they gave birth. About 1% of women in Sweden died in childbirth in the 18th century. Before that was reduced by a factor of 250, progress that was then duplicated in the United States, in Asia, in Malaysia, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Ethiopia. Health. For most of human history, the biggest killer was infectious disease. That is no longer a major source of mortality in the developed world. And even in the developing world, where infectious disease is still a killer, the 5 most lethal infectious diseases have all been reduced just in the last 15 years: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories to feed a active adult male, and most countries in most of human history were unable to grow that many calories until the agricultural revolution in 18th century England, which saw advances in agronomy such as crop rotation. Later, the invention of synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of agriculture, and the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids accelerated during the Green Revolution of the 50s and 60s. So other parts of the world have similarly developed the ability to grow enough calories to sustain their populations: the United States, France, and more recently, China, India, and the world as a whole. Now, this would be a dubious example of progress if all of those calories were just going to making fat people fatter. But in fact, they have decimated the rate of undernourishment. In 1970, 35% of people in the developing world were undernourished. That has fallen to less than 15%. Again, the advances were uneven across geographic regions. Latin America was the first region of the developing world to conquer undernourishment, followed by Southeast Asia, South Asia and East Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa is following down the same pathway. An example of the effects of insufficient calories are stunting of children, and no longer a problem in the United States. Colombia has brought its rate of stunting down. China and Kenya and Bangladesh all showing spectacular progress. The most extreme manifestation of insufficient calories, of course, takes place during famines. Famine was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and could bring devastation to any part of the world. Today, famines take place only in the most remote and war-torn regions. Famine today is not a matter of not being able to grow enough calories, but it's a matter of wars making those calories inaccessible to a population. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was little to no economic growth to speak of. This graph shows the gross world product from the year 1 to the present. And as you can see, for about 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high until the Industrial Revolution, the advent of technology, especially technologies for energy capture, the spread of education, the growth of institutions like markets and finance, and more recently, global trade. The Great Escape, as the economist Angus Deaton has put it, from universal poverty and squalor, was again highly uneven. The UK and the US were the first to escape from widespread poverty. More recently, East Asian countries like South Korea have escaped. Here we have a graph for a country in Latin America, Chile, and China and India, though still far poorer, are showing exponential growth. Now, once again, these increases would be a dubious example of progress if they were simply going to making the 1% still wealthier. But in fact, these advances have been accompanied by a huge reduction in the rate of extreme poverty, the bare minimum necessary to feed oneself and one's family. By that criterion, 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. That has now fallen to less than 10%. In fact, the rate of extreme poverty has fallen by 3/4 just in the last 30 years. Development economists call this the greatest accomplishment in human history, and virtually no one is aware of it. As a result, international inequality, which necessarily increased when the first countries escaped from the condition of universal poverty, has now turned a corner and is beginning to decrease because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. Now, inequality within developed countries, of course, has been increasing, but that doesn't mean that rich countries have been increasingly callous toward the plight of the needy. Quite the opposite. For most of European history, the richest countries devoted no more than 1.5% of their GDP to social spending, such as on children, the elderly, the sick, and the poor. But in the 20th century, every developed country went on a binge of social spending, so that today the median amount of redistribution among OECD countries is 22% of GDP that gets redistributed. As a result, in developed countries, poverty has decreased. In 1960, poverty, when measured in terms of disposable income, that is after taxes and transfers, was almost 33%. That is 1 out of every 3 Americans lived in poverty in 1960. That has fallen to less than 7%. And when poverty is measured in terms of what people can afford to buy, their food, clothing, and shelter, the rate has decreased from 30% to 3%. Peace. For much of human history, war was the natural state of relations between countries, and peace was merely a brief interlude between wars. We can see that in a graph that plots the percentage of time that the great powers of the day, the biggest empires and states, were at each other's throats in wars. And what the graph shows is that 400 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war with each other. Today, they are never at war against each other. The last great power war pitted the United States against China in Korea 65 years ago. Now, if we zoom in on the 20th century, we will see that despite the fact that wars were becoming shorter and less frequent, 2 of the ones that did occur were massively destructive in terms of their the number of people who were slaughtered. And many of us grew up with the confident prediction that this was an accelerating trend, that World War III was just a matter of time. It would pit the United States against the Soviet Union. Because it would be fought with nuclear weapons, it would be even more destructive than the 2 world wars. But we now know that the Cold War ended peacefully, the Soviet Union went out of existence, and World War III never happened. Indeed, if we now zoom in on the period after World War II, we see that there has been an uneven but unmistakable decline in deaths from wars of all kinds, from about 22 per 100,000 per year death rate during the Korean War to 1.2 today. This is a gift of the growth in affluence, because poorer countries are more likely to fall into civil war, of trade, because countries that trade with each other are less likely to go to war. You don't kill your customers. And the rise of international norms and organizations that have removed war as a legitimate move in the resolution of disputes between countries. Freedom and rights. We have all been alarmed by the threats against democracy, the erosion of democracy in countries like Turkey, Venezuela, Russia, and the rise of authoritarian populism in Eastern Europe, and for that matter, the United States. Nonetheless, when you count up the number of countries that are democratic and autocratic, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. Now, lest this seem impossible to believe, recall that in 1971, the world had only 31 democracies. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and lived under the domination of Marxist totalitarian dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of a military junta, as was most of Latin America and most of East Asia, including Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, and the Philippines, all of them democratic today.
Indeed, the liberal values, women's rights, respect for democracy, gay rights, encouragement of children to be creative and autonomous, have increased in every part of the world, most obviously in Protestant Western Europe, but also in Southern Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the former Yugoslavia and USSR, East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Islamic Middle East and North Africa. There are big differences among regions, but in all of them, the trend has been upward. Child labor. In most of human history, at least a third of children were put to work in factories and fields. Europe and the United States brought the rate of child labor down around the turn of the 20th century, followed by countries like Italy, and the world as a whole is starting to bring down the rate of child labor. 3 years ago, the Nobel Peace Prize was shared by Kailash Satyarthi, an activist against child labor, and these graphs show that his efforts have brought about real results. Violent crime. In any part of the world that exists in a state of anarchy, there will be high rates of interpersonal violence, of raiding and feuding. This was true of medieval Europe, when the homicide rate was 35 per 100,000 per year. Then, with the consolidation of kingdoms and the advent of rule of law across what used to be a patchwork of fiefs and baronies, the rate of homicide in European countries fell by a factor of 35 and is about 1 per 100,000 today. That process gets replicated whenever zones of anarchy are brought under the control of the rule of law and the police and court system replace cycles of vendetta and revenge and blood feuding. It happened again in colonial New England. It happened in the American Wild West. And it has happened in Mexico, which still has one of the world's highest homicide rates, but a century ago it was even higher. If we zoom in on the last 50 years or so, we see that the United States, after undergoing a boom in violent crime in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, has brought its crime rate back down by a factor of 2. And the world as a whole has seen its homicide rate fallen by almost a third just in the last 20 years. It's not just homicide that has been reduced, but also violence against women, such as domestic violence against wives and girlfriends, and rates of rape and sexual assault, and the victimization of children. Despite the legitimate concern that we have for bullying, it in fact has been in decline. Violent victimization at school has fallen since records first were kept, as have rates of physical abuse and sexual abuse. Indeed, we've been getting safer in just about every way. Thanks to improvements in the safety features of automobiles, the engineering of safer highways, and better enforcement of traffic laws, we are 96% less likely to be killed in a car accident, 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die by fire, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. But there is one exception to the trend of increasing safety, and it occurs in the category that safety engineers call poison by solid or liquid, and here you are seeing the American opioid epidemic. At the same time, we are 95% less likely to be killed on the job, 89% less likely to die in a so-called act of God, such as a drought, fire, wildfire, flood, storm, volcano, landslide, or meteor strike, presumably not because God is any less angry at us, but because of improvements in the resilience of infrastructure and in emergency responses. And what about the quintessential act of God, the projectile hurled by Zeus himself, the literal bolt from the blue? Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. The natural state of humanity is illiteracy and ignorance. In 15th century Europe, no more than 15% of the population could read and write. By the 20th century, Europe and the United States had achieved universal literacy, and the rest of the world is well on the way to catching up.
Here you have a graph for Chile, Mexico, and the world as a whole. Today, 80% of the world's population can read and write, 90% of the world's population under the age of 20. And not just men, but women. In 1750, there were only 6 women who could read and write for every 10 men who could. That by 1900, England had achieved gender parity, and that is just about true for the world as a whole. The world is very close to gender parity and literacy. Even the most backward parts of the world, Pakistan and Afghanistan, when it comes to girls' education, have shown spectacular gains. And for this, we have to thank at least in part, the other winner of the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize, Malala Yousafzai. Basic education, that is an elementary education in the beginning, the first year of a secondary education, have also increased all over the world. Eastern Europe later than Western, and East Asia, Latin America, Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, and again, Sub-Saharan Africa starting to close the gap. And in what I think you'll agree is the most incredible, unbelievable, difficult to swallow example of progress of all, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-documented phenomenon called the Flynn effect, IQ scores have increased all over the world by 3 points a decade for a century. This is the result of the expansion of education, of advances in public health, and probably also from the trickling down or proliferation of technical concepts and visual symbols from science and technology into everyday life. Okay, well, I've given you a number of statistics of the kinds of things that economists like to measure. Have they actually improved the quality of our life? Well, in many ways they have. For example, in 1870, the average work week in the United States and Europe was more than 60 hours. Today it is fewer than 40 hours, and the average worker gets 3 weeks of paid vacation, which would have been inconceivable in the 19th century. Thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we forfeit to housework, which people say is the least favorite way of spending their time, not surprisingly, has fallen from 60 hours a week to less than 15 hours a week. Thanks to the shrinking work week and the chunks of our lives that we regain from domestic drudgery, the amount of leisure time has been increasing for at least 50 years, more prominently among men than among women. And the reason that the rate of the increase in leisure time leveled off for women is that women today spend more time with their children. In fact, a single working mother today spends more time with her children than a married stay-at-home mom did in the 1950s. So forget Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. We also fork over less of our paycheck to necessities, to food, clothing, and shelter, from 60% a century ago to a third today. Okay, well, do all these econometric measures make us any happier? The answer is they almost certainly do. There is a pretty substantial relationship between life satisfaction and income, measured in gross domestic product per capita. This is plotted on a log axis, so the actual relationship bends over. An extra dollar makes a poor person much happier than it makes a rich person. But the relationship holds across the scale. Each one of these dots stands for a country. Each one of the arrows impaling a dot stands for the population within a country. What the graph shows is that people in rich countries are happier than people in poor countries. Within every country, richer people are happier, with the expectation that as the world gets richer, its people should get happier. And the longitudinal data that we have are consistent with that expectation. In 86% of countries for which we have data spanning several decades, happiness has increased over time. Interestingly, the United States is not one of them. Has all of this come at the cost to the environment? And the answer is it surely has. But as societies get wealthier They can afford to turn their attention to the environment. They can afford regulations and technologies that reduce pollution, and people's values tend to change as their society becomes more affluent and they start to care more about their environment. In the United States, for example, since the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, our population has increased by 40%. Our GDP has more than doubled. We drive twice as many miles, but the amount of the 5 major air pollutants that we emit has fallen by an average of 60%. Other trends that suggest that many aspects of the environment are turning a corner are deforestation. In temperate regions of the world, deforestation has ceased. In fact, it's reversed as forests start to take over abandoned farmland. In the tropical world, deforestation continues at an alarming rate, but there's reason to think that the peak has been passed and that it is starting to decline. Another example is that as the world has shipped more oil by sea, it has had fewer and fewer oil spills, and the amount of the Earth's surface that is protected against economic exploitation has doubled both on land and in the sea. Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of seeing the glass as half full or of wearing rose-colored glasses, but it is a demonstrable fact. So how is the fact of human progress reflected in the news? Well, I'm going to show you the results of a technique called sentiment mapping, which tallies up the proportion of positive and negative words in news stories. And the results show that during all these decades in which our lives have been getting longer and healthier and safer and more peaceful and richer and freer and happier, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose. And for that matter, a summary of the world's broadcasts has gotten glummer and glummer. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer comes from the nature of cognition. People estimate risk and danger according to a mental shortcut that Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman called the availability heuristic. Namely, the more readily something comes to mind, the higher it is in the brain's search engine results, the more prevalent we judge it to be. So people, for example, when asked, will say that tornadoes are more deadly than asthma attacks, whereas asthma attacks kill probably 80 times more people than tornadoes in a given year. But of course, tornadoes are much more photogenic. Indeed, if you combine the nature of cognition with the nature of news, news is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, "I'm reporting live from a country that is at peace," or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. Now, as long as violence has not vanished off the face of the earth, there will always be examples to report on the news, and so our sense of how prevalent they are will be distorted by our ability to recall images and anecdotes and narratives. Also, news is about sudden events, not gradual trends. And bad things can happen very quickly, but good things aren't built in a day. As Max Roser has pointed out, the papers could have run the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. Also, studies have shown that journalism has a systematic bias toward the negative, best captured in a headline from the satirical newspaper The Onion. CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Well, if you combine the nature of journalism with the nature of cognition, you can understand why the world is coming to an end and has been for a very long time. There's also a psychological phenomenon called the negativity bias, that bad is stronger than good. We dread losses more than we anticipate gains. We remember how bad recent events were more than how good they are. Explaining an observation by Franklin Pierce Adams, nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. There's also a kind of market for profits, that Pessimism sounds serious. Pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimism sounds frivolous. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Also, there's a kind of status competition among elites, that different prestigious groups are all kind of jockeying for prestige and moral credibility. And to complain about how awful modern society is a backhanded way of putting down one's professional rivals. It's a way for academics to look down on business people, for business people to look down on politicians, for political challengers to disparage political incumbents. As Thomas Hobbes put it 350 years ago, competition of praise inclineth toward a reverence of antiquity, for men contend with the living, not with the dead. Let me end with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that have surely occurred to many of you. First, isn't it good to be pessimistic, you might think, to speak truth to power, to rake the muck? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we have to be aware of danger and suffering and injustice wherever they occur, but we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because even if there are dangers to complacency, there are dangers to indiscriminate pessimism, such as fatalism. If all of the efforts of humanity at improving our lot have been a waste of time, well, why bother? Why throw good money after bad? As Jesus said, the poor will always be with you. And if you're convinced that we are doomed, that if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence will, well, the rational response is, well, let's enjoy ourselves while we can. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The other danger of thoughtless pessimism is radicalism. If you think that all of our institutions are failing and beyond all hopes of reform, a natural response is to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground out of the expectation that anything that rises out of the rubble is bound to be better than the failing institutions we have now, or to empower a demagogue who promises only I can fix it. Is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That wouldn't be progress. That would be magic. And progress is not magic. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems which must be solved in their turn. Also, there can always be nasty surprises. Against the backdrop of continuous progress, and I've discussed a number of them, the world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, and the American opioid epidemic. And there are severe global challenges which we have not come close to solving, including climate change and the threat of nuclear war. I argue in the book that these are indeed severe threats, but that we should treat them as unsolved but solvable problems rather than apocalypses in waiting. We have to pursue climate change by decarbonizing the world's economy as rapidly as possible via carbon pricing in the realm of policy and the development of low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies in engineering. And we should pursue denuclearization of the world through enhancing international stability and in reducing arms eventually all the way to zero. Just a couple of hints that these are not romantic, utopian, dreamy aspirations are the fact that the world's economy has been decarbonizing. If you look at how much CO2 has to be emitted to produce $1 of economic value, you see that the UK and the US have gone through a U-shaped curve in carbon intensity. With the Industrial Revolution and the burning of massive amounts of coal, CO2 emissions per dollar of GDP increased. But then with the transition to petroleum, then to natural gas, then to renewables, nuclear, and hydro, the amount of CO2 has decreased. That trajectory was kind of replicated by China, although there was a period where its carbon intensity literally flew off the charts because of Mao's harebrained scheme of having every peasant have a backyard iron smelter where they melted down their woks and doorknobs and knives to make useless steel, with the result that the CO2 emissions soared and economic value was zero. But then Mao died, China came to its senses, and its rate of carbon intensity has fallen. And India has now turned the corner as well. Now, I have to emphasize that this graph does not show that we are on our way to solving the problem of climate change. Those numbers have to go to zero, and at current rates, they are not heading to zero. But what it does show is that modern economies and wealth creation is not inherently tied to flaming carbon. Also, for all of the terrifying state of the world in terms of nuclear weapons, it used to be worse. This graph shows that the world has reduced its nuclear arsenal by 85% since the heyday of the Cold War. Again, this is not a cause to be complacent. Those numbers ought to come down to zero, but it does show that reductions are eminently possible. Final question, and this is one that is very sensitive to me as a defender of the very idea of human nature. Does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Is humanism arid or tepid or flattened, as some critics claim? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies are the happiest and healthiest places on earth, probably in the history of our species, and they are the top destination of people who vote with their feet. Also, I would argue that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, and I dare say spiritual. It is not a myth. Myths are fictions, but this one is true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a hero story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity, to any sentient creature with the power of reason and the urge to persist in its being. For it depends on nothing more than the convictions that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Am I waiting for... I thought I was waiting for your provost to make an appearance, to materialize. Doug? Hey!
I'm back. Thank you.
Glad to see you here.
Raise the lights for a moment. We're going to have Q&A, and afterward, Professor Pinker has agreed to sort of sign books in the foyer, so let's take a seat.
Very good.
Here.
Very good, thank you.
So, after reading your big tome, and I was reading it late in the hours last night, I guess I can summarize it, and you can tell me if it's correct, that we've never had it so good.
Well, in some ways that is true, and I use as an epigraph for the section on progress a quote from former President Barack Obama. He said that if you had to pick a time to be born, you didn't know where you'd be, who you'd be, what race, what continent, you'd pick now. And I think that's absolutely right.
So I guess I have a question, and there are two mics at the floor, so if you have questions, please come down and feel free to share. But I have a question about, it strikes me that it's a habit of mine to think in terms of this humanistic perspective. And so how would you describe intellectual virtues that we as individuals can practice to sort of restore confidence in the future and progress in humanism and science?
Yeah, so one of them would be a certain humility about our own convictions as individuals. We are made of crooked timber. We are products of evolution. Each one of us is vulnerable to fallacies and biases, and we all think we're right, and we can't all be right about that when we disagree, and which affords a certain amount of respect for institutions that force ideas to come into conflict, that like open debate, free speech, peer review, a free press, where you can say what you want, but you also can be criticized for saying it, and that people follow rules that everyone can agree upon are ways of understanding our world better and ways of coming to values that we all are likely to share, such as life, health, prosperity, happiness, freedom, education, and so on. Then the conviction that we can know more, understand more, should be deployed in service of making as many people well off as possible. Just again, it's partly nudged by our sense of sympathy, the fact that we can empathize with people unlike us, especially when we are encouraged to see the world from their point of view, and by the empirical finding that we can succeed, that when you measure human well-being, it really does show improvement. So the efforts of our ancestors have not been for naught.
We have a question over here.
Yes, hello. Professor Pinker, so I was just curious, this may be an issue more of semantics than it is perhaps a question, but I suppose it would be clarifying to understand what exactly reason is. Because as you were speaking, I was thinking, so say we grant your premise that reason is an enlightenment value that we should be chasing, but what's reasonable to one person may be unreasonable to another. People may weigh the different, they may have their own personal biases, which may result in them weighing reason slightly differently. So I'm curious how you would go about defining reason.
Yeah. Well, there are really two questions. One of them is how you define reason, and the other is how do you make people more reasonable, whatever the definition turns out to be. So the first, in a sense, you can't define reason because any definition would itself have to be expressed or motivated by reason, and so it would be, in that sense, inherently circular. But there's a sense in which you don't have to defend reason or define reason. We use reason, which is different from actually articulating and defending it. That is, even to raise the question that you raised, namely, how do you define reason, itself presupposes that we're reasoning, that there can be some answers to the question that are better than others, that we have enough common ground, that you're lobbing the question my way and waiting for an answer. Reason is the water that we swim in. It's the air that we breathe, and it's not something that has to be exactly defined and justified. In terms of how you get people to conform more to reason, the various norms and institutions and rules of the game, if you want, that I alluded to would be the answer. When it comes to beliefs about the empirical world, it would be through empirical testing, the methods of data and science. When it comes to logical consistency, or it would be the norms of logic and probabilistic reasoning. When it comes to matters of value, it would ultimately, since those are not logically provable, but still the fact that we, most of us, do have some bedrock convictions about what is good, namely, it's good for me to be well-fed and happy and healthy and live as opposed to dying, means that as soon as we start the game of reason, I've got to grant the same privileges to you because there's nothing magical about the pronoun I that makes my interests special. And so from the bedrock of each one of us caring about ourselves and the very act of entering into discourse, then we have a basis for moral argumentation that is not just a matter of taste, but that can actually proceed, that is actually make progress. And evidence that it can make progress is that there are certain things that used to be debated that are no longer debated. They're just done deals, like slavery, like human sacrifice, like the criminalization of homosexuality in more and more of the world.
So the idea is we just sort of reach a certain threshold and then we cut off the debate there?
Certain ideas, when the light of reason is shined on them, certain bad ideas cease being tenable. You just don't have, even among the most benighted sectors of debate today, you don't have people making arguments for slavery, or at least not very many. I mean, I'm sure on the internet you could find them, but they have not reached the mainstream.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for visiting us and for your talk, and enjoy reading your work and discussing it, agreeing and disagreeing with you. A question, why a totalizing, aseptic celebration of the Enlightenment rather than a symptomatic, diagnostic, double-conscious reading of it from a whole variety of constituencies, non-Western, Black Lives Matter, Afro-pessimism? So what is at stake in not reading it, I would say, diagnostically? My thesis would be something like, yeah, I agree with you that there is the non-negotiability for the need for reason, but along with that axiomatic insistence, add the contradictory thought that in history, the very becoming of reason has been profoundly unreasonable.
Well, there is not a totalizing admiration of a particular period in history or a particular set of people. It's the ideals of reason, science, humanism, and progress that I'm advocating. I'm using enlightenment as a term to embrace those ideals, but there is no such thing as the creed of the Enlightenment. They argued with each other, they disagreed with each other, and they got a lot of things wrong. But it was historically where the ideas were most concentrated and most influential, so it's a handy label. But yes, many of these ideas have been independently advanced in India, in the Islamic world, in China, in Africa. It's the ideas that matter, not the particular a bunch of guys and a few women in the second half of the 18th century that are worth celebrating. I would be totalizing when it comes to reason, because if you're not, you've refuted yourself, because any defense of something other than reason has to use reason. And if it doesn't, then there's no reason to take it seriously. So I'm totalizing the ideal of reason, but certainly not a particular period in history. There is no such creed because they argue with each other.
Yeah, but my question had to do with the historicity of reason itself, and how the conflictual and how interestedness and partisanship are constitutive of the very ontology of reason.
No, I disagree
So what is the
with that.
critique? So the question is, where do you position the critiques? For many people, the Enlightenment immediately meant being colonized.
Are those critiques reasonable?
From whose point of view?
Are they reasonable? That is,
But it depends. The
should we
question
all,
is,
well, if not, then I don't have to take them seriously, because you just said they don't apply to me. I don't have to accept them. I don't have to refute them because you didn't argue for them.
No, that
if you're giving
isn't-
reasons for them, then you have acceded to reason.
But I think there's a way in which one can support reason and at the same time be diagnostic of it through historical production, rather than thinking of reason as something immaculate or something which is by nature axiomatic.
No, okay.
I don't want to take up other
one can
people's
certainly critique particular people, including ourselves, as failing to carry out reasonable arguments. Lots of people thought they were reasonable and they were wrong. It's reason that allows us to argue that they were wrong. But these are critiques of the applications of reason in a particular time or place. And the thing about reason is that it can always step back and analyze the claims to reason of anyone at a particular time. And it may be that people who think they're being reasonable aren't. Nonetheless, you're always falling back on reason. And if you're not, I don't have to refute the argument because you've given me no reason to believe it.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. I don't want to take other people's time. I teach Kant and Hegel all the time, but when I teach them, I say they are profound and simultaneously ethnocentric and racist.
Well,
and
they were.
The two things
Yeah.
go together, and I think there's a way in which that way of being double conscious kind of relativizes the claims one makes on behalf of reason as being
No, the first thing is true, the second one is not. So yeah, they were racist, and we ought to point that out. But the thing is that the argument for reason is not, hey, Kant was a great guy. He is our secular prophet, our secular Messiah. Let's parse his words and do what he says. That's not reason. Of course, Kant and all of them had some, first of all, in many regards, a number of them were reprehensible human beings, or at least they did reprehensible things. They may have said things that are wrong, but that does not indict the whole enterprise of using reason, because you've used reason to make those very points. It can't.
Thank you.
Yeah. Christian.
Hi, Dr. Pinker. Thank you so much for coming. So one could argue that being a citizen of the world is kind of like being a citizen of nowhere in particular. And there's a lot of reasons for the rise in populism that we've seen in Europe and the United States. But one might be a perception, accurate or inaccurate, that cosmopolitanism leads to a corrosion of identity and locality and community, and that somehow there's something existentially lacking there. And that pertains to the opioid epidemic that you mentioned. And I guess I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there is that. I mean, that certainly is one of the animating ideas behind authoritarian and nationalist populism, that you can't be a citizen of the world. But it's possible to be both a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan, and to have a loyalty and solidarity and a pride in a variety of other groups, and we all do that. We're all proud alumni of a university, we're fans of a sports team, we're citizens of a city, we're Americans and proud of certain aspects of America. We can do all of that while also being cosmopolitan citizens of the world. There's an argument that people like Anthony Appiah and Amartya Sen have made, that even though what you're saying is certainly true of human psychology, in that we want to be rooted in a local community, but that's not mutually exclusive with also having solidarity with all of our fellow humans. This is an idea, it's one of the ideas that I tend to associate with the Jewish Enlightenment of the 18th century, the Haskalah, where it was particularly acute in the Jewish population, where the accusation was, well, if you're Jewish, then that means that you must, in some sense, not be loyal to your country. And later on in the United States, of course, that accusation was also leveled against Catholics, who were supposedly loyal to the Pope as opposed to the president. But the resolution, at least in the Jewish Enlightenment, was you could be I think the phrase from Moses Mendelssohn was a Jew at home and a man in the streets. We would not put it that way now. But the idea is that you can take pride in certain communitarian and even tribal symbols, values, styles of dress, forms of humor, and so on, but at the same time count the suffering of people in another continent or another race, and I don't think those two are contradictory.
Thank you so much.
Christian?
So if the ultimate goal of humanism is human happiness and prosperity, I'm just wondering how you view the trade-off in time in happiness. So in an extreme case,
Trade-off between what?
The trade-off in time. So current happiness versus future happiness. So in an extreme case, if we all, work ourselves to death in the next couple of centuries to spread intelligence throughout the universe and then have a lot more happiness versus being happy right now, how you view that?
Yeah, that is of course we must give weight to the happiness of future generations. We should not consume the last drop of resources and let our grandchildren worry about it in their time. The problem with applying that reasoning is that our ignorance increases exponentially, or our knowledge falls exponentially with the future. So a lot of decisions that we think we're making to benefit the happiness of future generations might be out to lunch, just because we can't prophesy the future with enough precision to know what will increase the happiness of our great-great-grandchildren. There's some obvious things, like we obviously shouldn't cook the planet, we shouldn't extinguish species, but there's also so much that we don't know that we can't be too precise in executing that trade-off.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Pinker. Thank you very much for being here. You're definitely probably the best thing that's come out of Harvard since Robert Nozick, in my opinion.
Wow.
I would like to say, for another addition, compliment, that actually my friend who's here with me met his wife inadvertently because of you, because of your advice on the school that he decided to go to. Wow. You're touching lives, changing lives. All right, I feel like your presentation today presupposes that we're progressing towards something, that there is a destination point. I know that your background story is you're also a fan of Thomas Sowell. Anyway, that's what I guess that's what the Wikipedia said. Who knows who wrote that? So are you saying that there is a utopia, there is a heaven that we're going to eventually reach? On Earth? I know that in this argument, in this presentation, you said no. However, you've also said in some of your other work that right now we're just in sort of a blip, that we're really not progressing towards this safe time period.
No, there will not be a utopia, and it would be dangerous to seek one for a number of reasons. One of them is that people differ, both they differ genetically as individuals, cultures differ, and so what's optimal for one is not going to be optimal for the others. The other is that human nature is infested with various bugs and flaws. We're never going to come to perfect agreement. There's a variation across people in traits such as psychopathy and sadism and narcissism. And a lot of them are going to want to become leaders, and assuming that we aren't going to re-engineer the species, which we obviously should not try to do. That means that certain human flaws will always be with us. Also, as Robert Nozick and Isaiah Berlin and others have pointed out, there are certain human goods that inherently trade off against each other. You just can't have infinite amounts of both. So if you want, for example, perfect equality of opportunity, then because people differ, you're going to get inequality of outcomes. If you want perfect equality of outcomes, you're going to have to treat people differently and therefore be unfair in applying policy. You can't have perfect security and freedom. We could have a police state with surveillance cameras everywhere, and we could reduce violent crime to zero. But most of us would choose to tolerate a bit of violent crime and not live under that kind of totalitarian surveillance and punishment. So because of these various trade-offs, we're never going to attain utopia, and some of the worst atrocities in human history have come in pursuit of utopias, because if you are a utopian, then all those human beings are kind of a nuisance. They're kind of messing up your plan for a perfect world. So one solution to attain the perfect world is to get rid of them, get rid of the nuisances. And another is, if you really believe that infinite happiness and well-being are attainable, anyone who disagrees with you is kind of infinitely evil and worthy of infinite punishment. So those are a number of reasons why utopia should not be our aspiration.
You heard it here first.
To say nothing of the fact that the law of entropy would prevent us from attaining it even if we strove for it. But I think we don't even have to worry about that. I mean, we've still got 10% of the world's population living in extreme poverty. We've got wars going on in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere. We've got a third of the world living under dictatorship. So we can worry about those problems, kind of get everyone up to the level of Denmark, as Francis Fukuyama put it, and then we can worry about utopia.
Question.
Professor Pinker, in your presentation, you mentioned some of the alternatives to humanism, and in some of those alternatives, you mentioned the belief in religion and God, and how, as we've seen through history, the belief in God and religion have contradicted scientific advancement and even tried to impede such efforts. However, today, there are plenty of human beings who can believe in science, but also have a faith that they live by, a religion or a faith. They can believe in God and be scientists. So within the UCI community, there are plenty of students who are either Muslim or Christian or of plenty of other religious beliefs and faiths who are pursuing knowledge, who are pursuing science, research, and academic progress. So can we have both? Or do I have to abandon my religious faith in order to pursue science? What's your take on that?
No, and everything that you're saying is true, and that's largely because religions themselves, especially in some parts of the world more than others, have become more humanistic. They don't enjoin their adherence to stone adulteresses or homosexuals or people who work on the Sabbath. That people can at the same time belong to religious communities with all of the warmth and solidarity and pageantry and tradition, but they just don't get their morality from Scripture. And that's a good thing, because the morality in Scripture is largely, in large part, horrific. But that doesn't mean one has to abandon religion. One just has to have a morality that is justifiable while, according to your taste, enjoy all the benefits that religion can provide. And it has been a trend that religions have become more ecumenical, more universalistic, more humanistic. The religious denominations that have not gone in that direction, I think, continue to be a menace to human happiness, but it has been a trend in many religions to, largely under the influence of Enlightenment ideas, to become more humanistic. No more stoning homosexuals.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Professor Pinker. My question is, what are your thoughts on the belief that technology can solve basically any and all problems?
Well, if by problem you mean, first of all, it has to define what a problem is, like what the goals are. The goals, if the goal is human well-being, and that's not the only goal, but as long as that is the goal, then technology can't solve all problems, because not all problems are solvable, because there are trade-offs, and there's entropy, and there's chaos, and all kinds of things that will, and limitations of human knowledge. We can never be omniscient, but given the identification of problems as alleviating human suffering, I think technology, including, I don't know if you want to call policy technology, but policy is a kind of technology. It's a way of changing the incentives for human behavior. We don't have anything else, is the way I would put it. It doesn't mean that all problems will be solved by technology, but a combination of policy and technology in service of human well-being is our best hope, indeed our only hope.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Pinker. I hope I'm talking close to this. Thank you so much for coming out here. I have a quick question. Robert Wright, who you spoke with, Sam Harris, and Daniel Goleman are all very big proponents of mindfulness. I haven't heard too much of your opinion on it as a psychologist and scientist, so I just wanted to hear your take.
Well, certainly the idea of applying our awareness, our cognitive processes to as many aspects of life as possible, including our own limitations, biases, fallacies, and so on, is certainly a great idea. They're also advocates of meditation and Buddhism, and there I'm more agnostic. I've never gotten into them myself, but I have nothing against people who do. But certainly the overall goal of bringing more and more of our experience into our awareness and dealing with them as facts that we think about and think through is a positive value.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor Pinker. Thank you for coming here. And my question is that in your talk, you mentioned that education, school enrollment, and the literacy has increased dramatically in the past century. But I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on the quality of education? Also, in the U.S., presumably reason and critical thinking should be paramount in our schools, but we still see extremism and all this conflicted things. So I just wonder, what are your thoughts on having education to solve problems for humanity?
Well, I think there has been a trend, at least over the long term, over a century, to de-emphasize pure memorization, which was a large part of the educational curriculum a century ago, and to encourage more thinking and problem solving. That's one of the explanations for the Flynn effect, the rise in IQ scores, namely that even holding number of years of education constant, the ability to apply what you know to new problems has been enhanced at least over a long time scale. There's reason to worry about shorter time scales, and I agree that there should be a greater emphasis on critical thinking and education at all levels, with the proviso, and I discuss this in the book, that when it comes to being critical about critical thinking curricula, a lot of them don't accomplish much. You give kids a test of critical thinking before and after they've taken the critical thinking course, and there's no difference. So we've got to be critical about critical thinking. This doesn't mean that it's a waste of time, but it does mean that we have to think carefully about what is the most effective pedagogical means of encouraging it at all levels. Likewise, critical thinking traditionally has focused on logical fallacies like the ad hominem fallacy, the no true Scotsman fallacy, and so on. It also has to concentrate on debugging our statistical and probabilistic biases, like the availability heuristic and other limitations of probabilistic reasoning. So I do think those should be embedded in the curriculum at all ages with a empirical evidence-based mindset that asks what will actually succeed.
Thank you, Professor.
Hello, Professor Pinker. Thank you for coming out here and sharing your ideas and giving your time.
Thank you.
I had an idea for a question when you, on one of the slides you mentioned the idea of more or less kind of a profit market arising. And I was specifically thinking on that with something along the lines of like a Ray Kurzweil or something like that, where he kind of posited the idea of the technological singularity, and he's very fond of it. He likes the idea of everyone merging into Terminator robots. Will all be the $20 million man, so forth. I was wondering specifically your notion for things like that arising, and the effects specifically for something like AI, kind of the God in the box scenario, a technology that could be that powerful that we could not mess up once. We would essentially have to get right on the first time, and the implication of a technology with that scope, more so than enriching plutonium, and basically the forward worry to an event like that leading up to it, and if there's any value to discussing something like that could be very far off into the future.
Yeah, a couple of things. So I have a huge amount of admiration for Ray Kurzweil. Among other things, he invented the reading machine.
I really do like his writing. I didn't want to.
But I think the idea of a technological singularity, which would include devices recursively improving their own intelligence in a exponentially, and therefore finding a cure for mortality, I think are quite fanciful. As is the pessimistic flip side to that, which is that as soon as we develop recursively improving intelligence, it will become so brilliant that it will do to us what we've done to animals. Maybe it'll keep us as pets, maybe it'll turn us into paper clips, and it's going to happen so fast that we should not go there, because the next thing you know, we'll all be pets. So I do think that that's fanciful as well, both the techno-utopian side and the techno-dystopian side, and I discuss them in the book, both of them. There are a lot of reasons to think that we will not achieve immortality, just because our bodily systems have been selected by evolution at every level to senesce, that is, to trade off vigor in youth against decrepitude in age, and there would be. Moreover, if you just look at the pace of medical progress, it does increase. There are no signs of it shooting up exponentially. Anyone who reads a medical newsletter knows about the miracle drug that turns out to be no better than the placebo, the promising result that washes out in the meta-analysis. It creeps along, and I encourage it, but there's no reason I think, to fantasize about that exponential improvement. In terms of the dystopian side, I discuss this in a fair amount of detail in the book. I think the nightmare scenarios, first of all, confuse intelligence with dominance. It just so happens that those tend to get bundled together in our species, at least in one gender of our species. Because we are products of evolution, But tools that we create are not products of evolution, and there's no reason that problem-solving ability should be bundled with an urge to dominate, subjugate, a kind of a Nietzschean will to power. I think we project that onto our inventions because we look at the worst of our own nature, but it's not inherent to intelligence. And the idea that we'll be collateral damage, that we will give an artificial intelligence system a goal like curing cancer, and so it will draft us all as involuntary guinea pigs for fatal experiments, or we give it the task of solving the problem of war, and so it kills all humans because that would be the ultimate state of peace. I think that those are also fanciful. In fact, they contradict themselves because they assume that we will be so brilliant that we could engineer a system that could figure out how to cure cancer, but so idiotic that we don't make it clear to the system what we mean by curing cancer, and that the system would be so brilliant that it could cure cancer, but so moronic that it wouldn't figure out what we mean by a cure for a disease. So I think that those fears are self-contradictory, aside from the fact that if you look at progress in artificial intelligence, it is, even though there have been some impressive gains in the last few years, but it's much harder than it's portrayed. That's why, despite the promise that any day now we'll have self-driving cars, they're still not here. It's a hard problem. Artificial intelligence is a really, really hard problem. It's not going to be solved instantaneously. It depends on knowledge of the world, and knowledge has to be acquired on the time scale of the world. There's a huge amounts of uncertainty. The world changes as we develop our own engineering systems. Lots of reasons why it's not going to happen in an eye blink.
It certainly won't happen here. We have time for one more question.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much again for.
Yeah, let's wait.
Okay. Got in. Thank you again so much for visiting with our community here. I was curious, really quick, if we could talk a little bit about personal enlightenment. I recently heard that if one feels so enlightened, they should go and spend a week with their parents. And I kind of feel like it's true, maybe around the holidays, especially when the conversation inevitably turns to politics. So I was just curious if you could share maybe an experience or two with how the principles you've described in your book have kind of impacted your day-to-day life.
Yeah, they've. I certainly make an effort to read articles from people I disagree with. I read reviews of my book, including negative ones. I read articles on the other side of the political spectrum. I try to, as much as is humanly possible, to consider where I might have been wrong in the past, where I might be wrong today. Now, granted, I'm not superhuman, and so I'm sure that I believe some things with greater confidence than I ought to, simply because it would be irrational to think that I don't, so I know that I don't. Which ones those are, I'm probably not the right person to ask, but I know that they exist. And I try to, I think with an appreciation of the value of reflection, mindfulness, if you will, self-control, to try not to surrender to first impulses when I have them. But,
great, thank you.
Before we move on to the next phase of the foyer for a book signing, I just want to thank Chancellor Gelman. I want to thank his team and the team from the Office of Inclusive Excellence for organizing this event. I also want to encourage you to sort of consult information about our programs this quarter and into the new year. And above all, I want to thank all of you for coming. And please join me in thanking Professor Pinker.